Apprenons l'anglais en contexte.
We haven't talked about professional integration.
L'insertion professionnelle.
Professional integration. Sometimes there can be a work culture difference here in Spain. But then let's say social integration as in general. What do you think is the most important factor in this process? Communication, and communication specifically, where do you put language? Do you think this is maybe the first or the most important step towards immersion?
L'étape la plus importante vers l'immersion.
The most important step towards immersion.
Yeah, I'd highlight the most important thing is flexibility. Like not assuming things have to be a certain way.
Ne pas supposer que les choses doivent être d'une certaine manière.
Not assuming things have to be a certain way.
Right.
Just because I grew up, my culture shows me that things should be in a certain way. That's what we call like ethnicism, like assuming that because my culture does it this way, it's the way to go. Like having that openness and flexibility to understanding that there's a different way of doing it. I may not like it, but it doesn't make it wrong. All right, so that's the first step towards like getting to know and meet a new culture. Language is an important one too. I would personally always recommend, like when you're going to live abroad, find out about the culture, as we said, like to try and minimize misunderstandings when possible.
Is it easy to survive professionally in Spain without speaking Spanish?
It depends on the sector, I guess.
Right.
All right, but generally speaking, I do think it would be important. All right, but yeah, language would be an important one too. All right, so starting to learn the language, but not necessarily like, suppose you do speak English at work. It's more like outside of work. Your life is outside of work too. And being able to build up on those social connections, get to know the culture,
right.
Understand a bit more about why things are the way they are. I do feel language would be important too. So starting to learn the language would be an important step too. And therapy is linked a bit to that in the sense of sometimes people feel so uncomfortable and embarrassed to make mistakes. Have to start from scratch.
Partir de zéro.
Have to start from scratch. Embarrass themselves asking for the wrong thing at a restaurant or at a shop. And there's this kind of unrealistic expectation of I'll learn on my own and once I'm proficient at the language.
To be proficient at a language, maîtriser une langue.
And once I'm proficient at the language, then I'll put myself out there and learn the and socialize with people. But that's not possible. Like, you need to put yourself out there, make room for the embarrassment of making mistakes.
Accepter la gêne de faire des erreurs.
Make room for the embarrassment of making mistakes. Because there's value there in being able to bond.
To bond, nouer des liens.
In being able to bond and meet other people, right? Like, yeah, there's the uncomfortable feeling. I've embarrassed myself. I've said something silly. It was a mistake. But instead of getting hooked onto that.
Au lieu de s'y accrocher.
But instead of getting hooked onto that and not letting go of that, being able to see the bigger picture and seeing like, I'm meeting new people, I'm getting to know more about the language, this is interesting or not, that would be an important one too. And then the third aspect I feel when going to live abroad would be what we were talking about before, finding that balance between leisure, work, as well as self-care.
Trouver l'équilibre entre les loisirs, le travail et le soin de soi.
Finding that balance between leisure, work, as well as self-care, finding alone time. And I think this is important too. Think to what you were saying about the language. Sometimes we work with study abroad students, and sometimes their expectation, what they do, is to come here. It's a short period of time, sometimes a semester, sometimes even 6 weeks. And their expectation is midweek I go to class, and then at the weekends I travel non-stop around Europe. And that's not fully an immersion in a new culture, right? Like, they don't really get the experience of what it is like to meet locals here in Madrid, to immerse yourself in the culture, to navigate those difficulties of having to make friendships from scratch. Many times they come and just hang out with their, American friendships that they've come with and travel with them. It's more like a holiday feeling, if that makes sense.
It begs the very last question.
Cela soulève une toute dernière question.
It begs the very last question. When do you need a therapist as an expat abroad?
Well, everyone's different. Like, we must acknowledge too that some cases, all right, people are maybe escaping from difficult situations they've had in the past or recently, like a breakup, or maybe in the past they might have suffered some trauma or suffered, an eating disorder or something like that. And going to live abroad is this unrealistic expectation of I'll be fine there, I'll be okay. And it's a typical time where, difficulties from the past can resurface because again, you're stripped away from.
To be stripped away from something signifie être privé de quelque chose.
You're stripped away from your social support. Obviously, there's the cultural and language barrier. Feelings of loneliness.
Les sentiments de solitude.
Feelings of loneliness are more heightened, right? So that's naturally where your own difficulties can come back to surface. So if you have suffered from something in the past that it does seem likely that will resurface, there's no trouble in asking for help from the start, before waiting to feel that bad to have to need the support then and there. And then anyone that might not necessarily have experienced something like that, maybe, everyone's different based on their case, but maybe after the honeymoon phase is starting to fade out.
Après la phase de lune de miel qui commence à s'estomper.
After the honeymoon phase is starting to fade out. We were talking about before about at first everything seems exciting, the novelty, but gradually, you start missing home, you're no longer as happy tolerating the differences. You start questioning, was this a right decision? Should I stay or should I go? All right. That would be a good time to go to therapy. Because as I said, there's the taboo or this expectation that you have to be really in a bad place to go to therapy. And it couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, thanks for coming, Miriam.
Not at all. Thank you for inviting me in.
Et voilà. Pour plus de contenu, abonnez-vous et activez la cloche de notification. À présent, essayez de faire un bref résumé de la conversation dans les commentaires pour évaluer votre compréhension. J'ai conçu un outil de pratique qui vous permettra d'être en contact au quotidien avec la langue anglaise. Vous aurez l'occasion de vous enregistrer, d'écouter votre voix, mais aussi d'obtenir un feedback, des corrections, tantôt au niveau de la grammaire que du vocabulaire, des activités de listening bien structurées et départagées en fonction des niveaux. Tout cela en plus des séances interactives en direct que vous aurez avec moi à travers la pratique de l'oral et l'écoute constante. Vous pourrez réaliser enfin ce rêve longtemps nourri de passer à un niveau supérieur de fluidité en anglais. Je vous laisse tous les détails en description et en commentaire. Let's get into it.